Hello, this is Alex Linder. I'm with Team White, and today we're going to talk to Jan in South Africa. We're going to try to give you a little picture of what Rhodesia was like. That, kiddies, was a country that used to exist in Africa and subsequently became Zimbabwe after power was handed over to blacks, but that's getting a little ahead of the story. Now, Jan is a member of a very specific small subset of people who are actually Boers who were in Rhodesia. Why don't we pick up the story there? Jan, I understand your folks, your parents, made their way to Rhodesia after the Second World War. Did they have any original connection there? And if not, why did they go from South Africa to Rhodesia?
They had no connection to Rhodesia at all. And my family is quite a big family. My mom is one of 7 children, and my dad was one of 6 children. The Boers used to have big families. Having anything from 5 to 9 children was the way the Boers used to work. And a huge chunk of my family, about half of the family, moved to Rhodesia in the late 1940s. My understanding is that after World War II, there were lots of people from Europe, and strangely enough, England. Large numbers of people from Britain were heading to Africa. And the Rhodesians were taking some of them in, but they were very picky about the whites they took in. So Rhodesia didn't take in many whites. And there were many whites who didn't qualify to get into Rhodesia, which rather then ended up in South Africa. Much later, when the whites and the blacks were fighting, that lack of manpower became a burning issue for Rhodesia. And in that sense, the Boers had a wiser policy of rather absorbing many more whites, even if they are, let's call it, lower standard and lower IQ and what have you. I really think that it's worked out better for the Boers, definitely.
Yeah. And Jan, how long had your family been in South Africa?
As best I know, the surname on my dad's side, that the original guy who came to this country in my family line was apparently a Prussian sergeant major in the 1820s. So that is as much as I know. I don't know much more detail. My mother's side of the family is Dutch. My father's side was German.
Okay. And so they arrived. How many whites were in Rhodesia at the time that they went there? Was there maybe 250,000 or something like that?
Alex, at its peak, at its absolute peak, which was about the mid-1960s, it probably touched on 300,000 for a little while. But during the time of the conflict, when I was growing up, you were looking at about 250,000. 250,000, and the numbers later started dwindling as the whites left. But it was a small population.
Did you live in the capital, or where did you live in Rhodesia?
I was born in the capital, which is now called Harare, but it used to be called Salisbury. And when I grew up, my parents owned a farm outside the capital. And that's where I grew up. Now, in Rhodesia, a farm was considered a property of 1,000 acres or more. In Rhodesia, anything under 1,000 acres was not considered a farm. That they didn't take you seriously if you said you had a farm and you only had 500 acres. Now, my parents had a little farm, which, like I say, wouldn't qualify as a farm. Their property was 128 acres, and they did dairy farming mostly.
Oh, dairy farming mostly. Now Rhodesia sits, 100% north of South Africa and just touching it a little bit at the southern tip.
Yes.
What are the countries that surround it now?
On the eastern side is Mozambique. Mozambique is a huge country that was created by the Portuguese. I'm not sure
And
the
that's on the
exact.
coast, right?
Yes, on the coast, very long country, very big country. These pieces of territory are large. Rhodesia, for example, is the same size as France, and Mozambique is almost double that size. Then on the northwestern side is Zambia, which is also almost double the size of Rhodesia. Zambia used to be called Northern Rhodesia. And then it also touches with Botswana on the southwest. And that is
And
a British colony. It's now independent.
mhm. And these will come into play as we're discussing the political changes. So anyway, you're surrounded by Black Africa, and then South Africa touches a little bit on the bottom,
Yes.
on the southern point. And this is essentially one country inland from the eastern coast. So
Yes.
it itself does not have a port. It's not at all touching the ocean.
Yes. And
But yet it is bounded partly by rivers, though, I believe.
yes, especially on the western side, there were rivers, and on the eastern side, it was mountains. So there's quite a lot of
Okay.
mountainous terrain there. And
On
most
the
of it,
on the eastern side. So now where you lived, what was the geography like in terms of your farming? What could you grow where you were? What was the growing season like and that sort of thing up
well,
there?
the nice thing about Rhodesia and the northern part of Rhodesia, there's lots of rainfall. Lots of rainfall, much better rainfall than South Africa. The place is very green, lots and lots of trees. It almost makes you think of, not quite, but almost like Vietnam or something like that. Lots of trees, lots of growing. It's very wild kind of place originally. Wild animals roamed all over the show. So it was very new, and it had only been colonized by whites in 1890. The entire period of time that whites occupied Rhodesia was from 1890 to 1980. It was 90 years exactly. And from that time, it went
Okay.
from a place that had nothing except blacks living in huts to a place that had, at one time, it was the world's biggest man-made lake, Lake Kariba. The whites were very proud of that. They created that in the 1950s, and all the cities and towns and roads, all of those were built up in just a few decades.
So, Jan, they created all the infrastructure was created by whites, and also didn't it have a nickname as the breadbasket of Africa?
Yes, it was called that. And Alex, there was so much agriculture that was going on in the country. The Rhodesians were extremely proud of their agriculture. In certain parts, because the climate varies a bit from area to area, there are some places like the south where it's a bit drier. So in the south, the whites would grow cotton. Then in the northern parts, the whites would grow maize and tobacco. It used to earn the most money out of tobacco. And in the days of cigarette smoking and that sort of thing, the tobacco was a roaring trade. Even under black rule, the tobacco also brought in billions of dollars. So, and just to give you a
Well,
bit more, Rhodesia was
mhm.
such an agricultural country, and the number of white farmers was not many. It was like about 5,500, 5,000 maybe more. It was such an agricultural country that they would do almost anything there. So there would be irrigation if they needed it. And so between the hot and the cold and the rainfall, they grew almost everything you could imagine. And they were constantly experimenting with new stuff. When I was growing up, they set a world record for the most maize harvested per acre in Rhodesia. They set a world record. I think it was something like over 100 bags an acre, when in South Africa the average was 10 bags per acre. The Rhodesians were very proud of their technical achievements. in many ways, they're almost a little bit like the Germans. They try to make everything go the extra mile. And because the
That's
Rhodesians
interesting.
were a bit poorer than the South Africans, we tended to operate on shoestring budgets. We actually did things that other people in the rest of the world and other people in the rest of the white world would not even begin to attempt, because they just say that's a joke. You can't do stuff like that with so little money. The same is also true of South Africa to quite a large degree. In Southern Africa, we've learned to make do, and whites can get a lot done with very little. And
Yes,
yeah.
yeah, and the point there is like white people had been in South Africa since what, like 1650, but they
Yes.
were only in Rhodesia for like 90 years. So he's saying they weren't quite as rich, but they had a can-do spirit. And I've heard it said they had some of the very best blood of the British Empire went to Rhodesia. And then they were joined by people like Jan coming up there. Well, let's talk about that. What was it like growing up there and going to school there? Did you catch any flack for not being English or being South African, or what was the attitude?
Yes, it was a bit strange. And when I was young, my parents spoke Afrikaans, so I grew up in a house where people were talking Afrikaans, and I had to go to an English school. So some of the kids teased us. I would say we were probably, perhaps about 10% of the white population there was Boer. And so we were teased a bit and so forth. But looking back on it, those are things that I regard as silly things. It's a kind of a pettiness that whites had in those days. You see, whites were prospering everywhere, so they had time to be petty and stupid. And whites did this all across the world, where the Frenchman mocks the German mocks the Italian, whatever. And nowadays, I don't even look at those things. I don't even think about those things. I just focus on the fact that we are white and we must stick together. But when I was a kid, it was a bit of a silliness, and it put me at a disadvantage. When I went to school, because my English wasn't that good, I struggled the first 2 years at school, and I was behind the other kids, but I enjoyed reading, and it took me about 2 years, and then I started passing the English kids by. So I made up for it, and thereafter I tended much of the time to be near the top of my class. So I didn't do too bad. Myself and another Afrikaans kid, we didn't do bad.
Good. And did you matriculate high school there?
I actually didn't finish high school. And maybe I should just mention a bit about our schools and when we grew up. I went to whites-only schools. So when I was a kid, all the little girls and boys in class were white. All the teachers were white. And that was so until I got into the middle of high school. Then from about 1977 onwards, then blacks started coming into our school. But even by the time I finished school, there would only be like 3 or 4 blacks in a class of 30 boys. In high school, I went to a boys-only white school. And so the blacks were starting to come in, but there weren't many. So I actually did go to school with a couple of blacks, but only towards the end. I actually left a year before I was supposed to matriculate. So technically, I'm actually a high school dropout.
Okay, but if you're able to do it, it doesn't matter. And that's
Yes.
the only standard that truly matters in this world. Now, what were the race relations between the whites in Rhodesia and the blacks compared to like South Africa, where we know about apartheid?
The Rhodesians always used to boast. They used to boast that they had the happiest blacks in Africa. That was a common boast, that the blacks were the happiest. And as far as I could tell, the blacks and the whites, I think they did get better a bit. They did get along a bit better than in South Africa. But in South Africa, you must know, with apartheid starting in 1948, you must know that it was under a lot of attack all those decades. So the South Africans were under more political and cultural pressure globally than the Rhodesians, because the Rhodesians officially didn't have apartheid, but in many ways there was apartheid. Rhodesians always tried to skimp around it, but the bottom line is that the whites of those days, everywhere, all the whites, regardless of whether they said they had apartheid or not, whether they were the French or whether they were the Portuguese, everybody was naturally somewhat racist. Everybody could look at a black and they'd say, no, man, those people aren't the same as us. And isn't it insane that we should hand over power to them? It's crazy, crazy, lunacy. So that's how whites were generally.
Okay, and how about the political views of the people? Did they see any threat that, eventually the blacks are going to take over? The press is promoting this international. What was, I guess, the political and the media situation there? Did you have Jew-owned papers like everywhere else? And what was the feeling that you could sustain that life indefinitely there, or that it was threatened when you were growing up in the 70s?
When I was growing up, there was definitely the beginning of trouble. When I was about 9 years old, the first real attacks took place on white farms, where blacks came with machine guns and AK-47s and hand grenades, and they started attacking whites. So that was the opening round of the war. It had simmered when I was young, before I was, let's call it, a thinking person. But as I grew up, the main thing on the horizon and on the politics was this terrorist war. And the whites were very concerned about the future. In the 70s, that was the constant topic, was how long can we stay in power? Can we win the war? Many times people thought, well, if we just hang in there, we can win. We can somehow survive. But as time went by, year after year, things would get worse and more violent. And there were more problems all the time. And we couldn't understand, we just couldn't understand why this stuff is happening. And we didn't think in terms of Jews. I discovered later, only very recently from Monica Stone, that there were tiny groups of Rhodesians who knew about National Socialism, who knew about the Jews, but the majority of us were what you would call conservatives. We were Christians. We'd been taught to believe that communism is bad, and we saw communism as the driving force behind the blacks, because the Russians and the Chinese were giving heavy weaponry to the blacks. So we knew that we're under attack by blacks who've been trained by the Russians and the Chinese. And we'd get their weapons, they'd capture blacks would be interviewed, they would talk, they would tell their story. So we'd see, Russia and China, they're arming up all our blacks, and they're busy trying to get our blacks to attack us. And we didn't understand. So apart from the handful of enlightened whites, there was a particular guy that I discovered details of him only recently. There were a couple of South Africans who came all the way from South Africa to live in Rhodesia and to help the Rhodesians. And there was a guy called Ivor Benson. And Ivor Benson was one of the most knowledgeable people about the Jews and communism. And he actually was a key person for Ian Smith for a while. But I later heard that Ian Smith got rid of him. And Ivor Benson was actually one of the cleverest people who knew and could see what was happening. He didn't talk about the Jews then, although later I discovered he knew all about the Jews. But what he said was that the aim of communism is to bring about a race war between the blacks and the whites. And you see the same thing happening in the world today. Like the Jews are setting the whites and the Arabs at each other, Christians and Muslims. You see the same thing.
Jan.
So,
Jan. I've been doing E. Michael Jones audiobooks, and he talks about this common phrase he uses, carry the war to Africa. And that goes back to John Brown in the U.S. and his raid at Harper's Ferry. He murdered some people trying to incite a slave rebellion. And the communist Jews see the blacks in America, since they weren't in Europe, as a vehicle for their communist revolution. So, yeah, they're going to empower these blacks to achieve their specifically Jewish ends under the universal cover of communism, which is, classless, nationless, brotherhood of man type garbage, but with, like you're saying, with a machine gun and a lot of murder. So, yeah, so they didn't fully understand this. What was the media situation at that time? What kind of papers? I guess it wouldn't have been too big if you had TV was just starting to get going in the U.S. I know it was behind the times in South Africa. They didn't let it in because they were smart.
Yes.
But what kind of newspaper and TV situation did you have there for these 250,000 whites?
Rhodesia got TV, I think, in the late 60s. We got black and white TV, so we had one TV station. And we had a couple of newspapers. The biggest newspaper was the Rhodesia Herald. I can't say anything about whether it was owned by Jews. I don't think so. All I've managed to discover about Jews in Rhodesia, and if I think back to what we saw at the time, the most common place you came across Jews were as doctors and specialists. There were lots of Jews who were doctors and specialists. And I remember my mother talking about her gynecologist who was a Jew and how a Jew surgeon had saved her life. So she looked on Jews in a positive way, and she thought they were a better people. And sadly, my awakening about the Jews occurred a few years after my mom died. I would have loved to have had those discussions with her later. But when we were there, the place you heard the word Jew was mostly with doctors, and the other place was some businesses. And in later digging, I discovered that quite a number of the mayors of Rhodesian towns and cities were Jews. So Jews filtered around in those levels. But I don't think they controlled the media.
Okay. So they weren't, the public was not really super knowledgeable about Jews in the larger sense. They're worried about running their 1,000-acre farms and enjoying life there. Now, what about, you mentioned to me when we've spoken other times about the relation. They felt, look, we backed you, UK, we backed you, Britain, our mother country in the war, and you're betraying us now. Get into some of that with the political development.
Just a quick one on the Jew. There was only one kid in my class who was a Jew. So 1 out of 30. Okay, getting back to Britain. Rhodesia was a British colony, but it had been given self-rule in 1923. Interestingly enough, in 1923, there was talk of either getting Rhodesia to join and unite with South Africa as a single country. And many of us later said, maybe that would have been a better plan. But at the time they had a referendum, and it was decided that the Rhodesians would stay a separate country. So the Rhodesians then started ruling themselves and taking care of most of their affairs. So the British government didn't run Rhodesia. The Rhodesians, the white Rhodesians, ran Rhodesia. And then they, in the 60s, when they engaged in UDI, that was one of their arguments. They were saying, listen, we've been ruling ourselves for the last 40 years, let us continue onwards. The Rhodesians had always been pro-empire and pro-Britain and pro-the Queen. They saw Britain as the nation that they belonged to. So they didn't see themselves as being close to the Boers and the South Africans. They saw their relationship as being with Britain. And in World War I and World War II, Rhodesians volunteered to fight for the British in large numbers. In fact, in World War II, they volunteered on such a large scale that they actually had to stop them because too many men wanted to go and fight for Britain. They regarded themselves as totally loyal. Also, the Rhodesian army assisted the British when the British were fighting the communists in Malaysia after World War II. So the Rhodesians said, we are more British than the British. That was quite a common thing that they said. We are more British than the British, and we have always stood by Britain, always, through thick and thin. But they became concerned by this tendency for the British to start handing over all these countries in Africa, because the British retreated out of Africa en masse. They gave away dozens of countries, huge pieces of territory. They handed over to the blacks quickly. They didn't even, the only place where the British fought a little bit was in Kenya in the late 50s. They fought a little bit in Kenya, and then they handed it over because the Kenyan blacks were too violent. The British sort of got it under control and then quickly found some black leaders they could hand it over to, and they were just giving away one country after the other. The big thing that set the scene for the whites in Africa, that the whites later discussed a lot, was there was a British Prime Minister who came here, Macmillan, and in the Parliament in South Africa in the 50s, he gave a speech called The Winds of Change. And he said, there are winds of change blowing across Africa. And he basically told the whites in the late 1950s that white people are going to withdraw from Africa. The West is going to withdraw from Africa. We're going to hand it over to the blacks. Now, the whites who lived here didn't like that idea. And the Rhodesians and the Boers and the other whites, even the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique, none of them liked this idea. But the impetus came from England. The British had decided this would be so.
And yeah, and we know that there was a lot of involvement of people like Kissinger who were telling them that this had to change, and have to go to one man, one vote becomes sacrosanct rather than upholding any actual values and not caring about process and not caring about consequences and the so-called higher morality of democracy, which always turns out to be a front for Jewish money. And, you see the result.
Yes,
So,
when Kissinger came to Rhodesia in 1976, the Rhodesians were constantly arguing with the British, and they'd present all these hard facts. They'd say, listen, can't you see what happened in Zambia in 10 years? Can't you see what happened in Kenya? Can't you see what happened in Nigeria? And there were, like in Nigeria, there were blacks who fought a war against other blacks. There was the Biafran War. 1 million blacks died fighting each other in Nigeria. And the Rhodesians looked at all these things and they said to the British, they said, listen, are you sure this is a wise thing to do? Look at what's going to happen to the economy. And how do you know that the country is going to remain in a situation where law and order is still going to function? And what about the food? And what about corruption? And what about this? And what about that? And the British, of course, they just said, no, you must hand over to the blacks. And when Kissinger came when the fighting was starting to get very heavy. And the British had been negotiating with the Rhodesians for about 10 years. And those talks had always ended with the two sides breaking up. Because remember, in 1965, on the 11th of November, Ian Smith officially rebelled against the British. That was the first rebellion of whites against the British Empire since the Americans of 1776. So that was the first formal actual rebellion by the whites. And so from 1965 to 75, the Rhodesians negotiated with the British, but they had seized control, they maintained control of the country, and they were fighting the war, doing their own thing and saying, no, we're not handing over to black communists. And then eventually the British dragged in you Americans, and of course, who comes but the Jewish face of America? We didn't know about that. We just saw Kissinger as an American. We didn't think of him as a Jewish American. And he came and he said to Ian Smith, he said, You must have one man, one vote. There is nothing else. We won't consider any other possibilities. It's one man, one vote or nothing. And they also put pressure on the South Africans because as the war was heating up, the South Africans were the only ones giving us petrol, because from the 1960s, the British, the Royal Navy, was cutting off oil tankers and oil supplies that came to us via the Portuguese port of Beira. So then the only petrol that we got, petrol and ammunition that we got, came from South Africa. So then what they would do is they'd come and they'd put the Boers under a lot of pressure. And then the Boer prime ministers would now start cutting off the fuel. Sometimes we were as low as a week or two's worth of fuel and or ammunition. And then that's when they'd come and negotiate. Then they'd say, if we cut off your supplies, your entire country will collapse in 2 months. So, come to the...
I mean, how dirty is that?
Absolutely.
Your own motherland is doing that to you.
Absolutely, Alex. All the whites were. I think Rhodesia might be unique in that only Rhodesia and Germany probably experienced the level of worldwide sanctions that any nations have ever experienced. Because Rhodesians weren't allowed to trade anything. If you see sanctions nowadays, when they say, sanctions against Iran, sanctions against Iraq, those sanctions are teeny-weeny sanctions. That's nothing like our sanctions. Everything was cut off. We were not allowed to buy or sell anything with any nation in the world. And they tried every way to stop us from trading. So the Rhodesians had to do things illegally. And there was quite a bit of sanctions busting as well. There was a guy who owned a couple of aircraft, and he would do sanctions busting. And then he would load up a plane load of Rhodesian beef, and he'd fly off to somewhere in Europe, and he'd land there, and they'd quickly do some deal illegally, and they would buy and sell stuff, and then he'd be back again. The Rhodesians tried to break the sanctions a lot, but South Africa was the most important economic thing that helped us to survive. And the South Africans also lent us weapons. So the Rhodesians only had like a handful of helicopters, and the helicopter gunships were extremely important in the battle with the blacks. The helicopter gunships were our equivalent of the tank. And those helicopter gunships were absolutely invaluable. So the helicopter gunships we had weren't even designed to be proper gunships. They were just French Alouette helicopters that could take 4 or 5 men. But the Rhodesians would put machine guns on them, and they became extremely important in the fight. And Rhodesia only had a handful.
Yeah, and I was going to say, let's get into that military aspect. So you got 250,000 people. You're beset by international sanctions and increasing media pressure. The people originally feeling good are starting to feel a little trepidation. You're seeing a lot of not great stability around you. We know the irony of the Americans getting involved in Southeast Asia after the French on the domino theory. They used to preach to us when I did international relations, and we heard about that if one of these countries goes communist, then the rest will surely follow. And it didn't really work out there so much, but really a sort of domino-like collapse did happen in sort of the southern cone of Africa, I think it's fair to say. Well, how were you guys outfitted? And I know you had the Selous Scouts?
Selous Scouts, yes.
What was the military front like for you guys?
Alex, and as you say correctly, a domino effect occurred in Africa, yet nobody seems to point that out. Absolutely. And when the blacks got one country, then the blacks in one country would cooperate with the Russians and the Chinese to help the blacks fight another white country. And that's what happened with Rhodesia. All these black countries around us were not openly engaged in warfare, but they allowed blacks to have bases there. They allowed the Russians and Chinese to come and
Yeah.
dump their military equipment. So all along our borders, these blacks were building up, and these blacks were building armies in neighboring states. Initially, it was only Zambia. The first 5 or 7 years of the fight was only from Zambia. But when the Portuguese collapsed, that's when it became a huge thing. Then the blacks were coming at us from all sides, and the eastern side was the worst side. It was very mountainous, very heavily wooded, and easier for the blacks to move in.
Yeah, and so the Portuguese collapsed in 75 around then or so?
Yes, that was
and
a huge
where was
disaster.
that, and what was that briefly? What happened there?
Alex, the Portuguese government had 3 countries in Africa. One of them was Angola, which is 1/4 of the size of the USA. So
Wow.
the Portuguese said that they are not going to give up any of their territory at all. And they fought all out from the 1960s onwards. They fought all out in Angola and in Mozambique against the blacks. They were calling up guys in Portugal, bringing them in. They'd come, they'd fight in Africa because they weren't going to give up their colony. And the way that the Portuguese resistance collapsed was that the CIA and the KGB organized a coup in Portugal. And the moment they got a communist-type general to take charge, the first thing he did was he gave away the countries that they'd been fighting for. So the Portuguese collapse meant that overnight, even the Portuguese people, and there were hundreds of thousands of them, there were actually more Portuguese in the Portuguese colonies, and they were fighting to keep those colonies. Overnight, they found themselves under black communist rule. The Portuguese packed their bags in Angola and they moved out. Most of them abandoned the country. When the collapse occurred in Mozambique, which was at the same time, of course, the whites there, literally, they just packed their bags. They fled overnight. Alex, they abandoned their houses. The Portuguese abandoned their houses, their property, everything. They jumped in their cars with just their shirts on their backs, and the next day they were in Rhodesia. And we met many Portuguese like that. And they were all welcomed in Rhodesia because they were fellow whites. They'd been fighting the blacks. So we got along great with the Portuguese. There were quite a lot of Portuguese kids in my class. So we got along well with the Portuguese.
Interesting. You never think about something like that.
Yes. You know, there are all these little communities, and they exist. For example, in what is now Namibia, about half of the population of the whites in Namibia, there's like about 100,000 of them or so. A good portion of them are Germans. So you have Germans in Southwest Africa, Portuguese in these other countries. And yeah, so these people, we were neighbors. The Portuguese were our neighbors.
Okay. Now getting back to the point, what was the Rhodesian military setup for fighting these fights?
The Rhodesian military consisted, the main army was about 28,000 strong. So out of 250,000 whites, there were about 28,000 trained soldiers. These were our guys who were called up, and that formed the real core of the fight for Rhodesia. When it came to the hard fighting, the whites did all the hard fighting. There were units, like you did get certain units that had black soldiers, and like you got the Rhodesian African Rifles, and that would be a battalion or regiment of black troops led by white officers. But on the whole, the real fighting was the whites doing the fighting. The black troops weren't that good. The only place where the black troops really distinguished themselves was in the Selous Scouts. But it may be also because the Selous Scouts operated completely differently to the Rhodesian army. So let me just describe the nature of the fights and how the fights carried on. The Rhodesian army, as a rule, would be patrolling in small teams in various areas. And their smallest units were what was called a stick. So the smallest Rhodesian unit was a stick. A stick was anything between 5 and 10 white guys. And those 5 or 10 white guys would go out on a patrol, and they'd go and they'd check out the villages where the blacks are living. They would sneak around and they'd see if they can pick up any indications that black terrorists were around. Because the blacks who lived in the villages, these blacks would be harboring the terrorists. So the terrorists wouldn't be walking around in the open, because the moment the whites realized that there were black communist terrorists in a region, they'd immediately attack them. So they'd send in what they called fire force. Fire force were the helicopters. A couple of helicopters would go, they'd chuck off 20 or 30 white guys, and they'd get into a firefight with the blacks, and they'd kill them all. And those they don't kill, they would hunt them down. Sometimes they would chase the blacks for 2 or 3 days as the blacks are fleeing. The whites became good at tracking, and the whites would just be hunting them for days on end, and the blacks would be running. The blacks, I'll tell you one thing about the blacks can move very fast over long distances when they want to. It is a particular feature of the black race, and I noticed it even among blacks that I was working with. Blacks are excellent long distance runners. For young blacks to run a good couple of kilometers is nothing. They don't even feel it. But the whites aren't that good at the long distance stuff. But the whites were good at tracking them, hunting them down, killing them, and that was how the Rhodesian army operated most of the time. But then when things got really tough, the Zulu scouts came in and they operated in a totally different way. They operated more along a police style that the British had pioneered to a small degree in Kenya. And the Zulu scouts worked by infiltrating. So what they would do is they would take a huge chunk of a big area and they would freeze it. The military term would be they would freeze this area. So this huge area, all the army and police, all the whites were moved out of it. And they were told, get out of there, the Zulu scouts is going in. So the Zulu scouts would go in and they would start infiltrating. And so the reason also for getting the rest of the army out was because the Zulu scouts pretended to be terrorists. So they would go and meet the real terrorists. Now, most of the Zulu scouts, 70% of it was blacks. But the whites were operating this whole thing and guiding it. So basically, these blacks would then go in under the command of the whites, and they would meet the other blacks, and they'd say, we are fellow terrorists. Now, of course, these black units have to have passwords and security and so forth. So our black terrorists would meet their terrorists and convince them that we are the real guys. And then it would be a case of luring them into meetings and ambushes where the other black and white Zulu scouts would kill them. So that was why the army had to get out of the area, the army and the police, because they might shoot our guys. So that is how the Zulu scouts operated. And they would go into an area and nobody else would be there, and they would look after themselves. They'd have no communication. They would just live in the bush and do their thing until they'd managed to wipe out the black terrorists who'd been there. And they were extremely effective. They reckoned that at the end of the war, the Rhodesian army said that 70% of the blacks that were killed by the Zulu scouts.
How about that? And how do you spell Zulu, and where does that name come from?
Zulu is Selous, and it comes from a hunter. I think his name was Frederick Selous, and he was a famous hunter, and because of that stealthy nature, that is why they chose that name for the Zulu Scouts. So they were the elite unit. But the other parts of the Rhodesian War were also important, and don't think that the whites didn't kill lots of blacks. the Rhodesian army. The Rhodesian army tried many different tactics, and lots of the different tactics that they tried worked very well. For example, my brother told me that my brother was in the Rhodesian SAS, Special Air Services. That is a elite British unit, and the Rhodesian army had a squadron of what they called the SAS, C Squadron. Now, my brother, as a young guy, he was actually the youngest white guy who ever joined the SAS. I think he was about 16 years old when he got his wings in the SAS. And my brother was in the SAS for a number of years, and then when he was older and the war was on the go, he was called up into the normal army. So then he operated with fire force and patrolling and that sort of thing. But he told me that in the early days of the fighting, the way that they did it was they trained, the blacks would attack them, they would shoot at them, and then the whites would carry out normal military maneuvers. And so a platoon of whites would say, okay, you go and outflank them over here. But the blacks would shoot, and then the blacks would run away. And so by the time you outflank them, the blacks are gone. So then one young military commander said, maybe we should attack the blacks frontally. When they are busy shooting at us, we should just attack them straight on. And my brother said to me when he first heard of this, he said, oh man, we're going to get killed. And when the guys actually started trying it out in practice, they found that it worked so well that the blacks were so shocked by the immediate counterattack of the whites that as they are shooting at the whites are attacking them aggressively. You'd have half the guys would be sitting shooting back while the other guys are running forward, and so they'd leapfrog, and that's how they'd counterattack. And when the whites counterattacked aggressively, the blacks would sometimes either just run away. They said there were times when they caught blacks hiding behind trees. The blacks would be absolutely petrified. They didn't know what happened, and the whites would be on top of them. And they'd just surrender because they'd never expected that kind of activity. And the other thing that the Rhodesians developed was the vertical envelopment, otherwise known as fire force, where a couple of helicopters come in, they drop off groups of guys at different positions, and then from the air, there's a guy in the K car, K being for kill, and the guy in charge of the K car, he'd be the commander of the battle. So these helicopters would circle, 2 or 3 of them, would circle, and they'd be firing on the blacks, and they'd be commanding the whites on the ground. And basically, they would be shooting up the blacks until they try and kill them all. My brother was in one of these operations once, and he told me that the battle raged the whole day, from the morning to late in the afternoon, and by then they'd killed all the blacks. But it was quite hectic fighting. And he told me that at one point in the battle, he found himself lying under a tree, and the leaves were raining down on him from the machine gun fire. So it was pretty intense.
Yeah, for sure.
No body armor and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So a real solid war goes on. Anyway, unless you have something more to say on that point.
Maybe I should mention the cross-border raids, because, many of the experience...
Jan, I wanted to make the point that Nixon really, really got vicious press hits for basically what you described. The commies were, I don't know, as the Laos or Cambodia, they were working on camps there to attack Americans in Vietnam. So he eventually bombed Cambodia, I think it was. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was Laos, maybe it was both. And
it was Cambodia. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Ho Chi Minh Trail, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so this is somewhat similar to what's going on there. The blacks have all these camps, except even worse, but surrounding the whole country almost, it sounds like. Or maybe not the mountains.
Exactly.
But
And Alex, the parallels between our war in Rhodesia and Vietnam, lots of parallels. It's almost identically the same situation. And that's why we couldn't understand, why do we have to retreat and give up? Look, the Americans are in the same situation. And we saw it as being a common war, because the weapons that were being supplied to the terrorists in Vietnam were from Russia. Your American soldiers, your 50,000 American soldiers who were killed in Vietnam, your guys were killed by weaponry that came from Russia mostly and China. Exactly the same people who were busy in Africa. And I see that, Alex, I see those wars as being the end result of the Jews beefing up Russia against Germany in World War II, and the Russians having all this superior technology and equipment and factories, and them now going on a worldwide campaign to turn the entire third world into communist states. That's basically what they did. And in Africa, they had their greatest successes. So in our part of the world, we experimented with different things. They tried all sorts of things. They tried horses and such things. But on the whole, the helicopter became the basic battlefield weapon that was the most successful. The Zulu Scouts with their sneaky tactics were extremely successful. But there are lessons that whites have learned in Africa in modern times that take us back to relearning lessons from ancient history, where we eventually learn that if you fight in the European way, that the European way works perfectly. And the best example of that are the cross-border raids, because instead of just fighting in little groups, they eventually began to think, you know, these terrorists are continuously crossing the border. Why don't we just attack their camps? And the original experiment was conducted by the Zulu Scouts. They went with trucks and they drove deep into Mozambique and they attacked a camp, but they actually drove into the camp that they were going to attack. And they did it all. They put on uniforms of the black troops, and the whites covered themselves with black polish and so forth. And they pretended to be black troops, and they actually drove into a base and physically attacked the blacks. And they did it at a time when they knew the blacks would be on parade, and they killed hundreds in that first attack. And then they realized, goodness me, we killed hundreds of blacks in one attack. We killed more blacks in one attack than we've killed in an entire year. And the downside for Rhodesia was every time the Rhodesians tried to defend themselves, every time, you know, it's a recurring story, actually, Alex. It happened in South Africa. It's the same with Hitler in Germany. Whenever the whites are under threat and they realize, you know what, we're constantly being attacked by outsiders, it's time for us to counterattack. Then when you counterattack, that's when the worldwide Jew media and Jew-influenced politicians jump all over your case. So that was always the big fear in Southern Africa, even for South Africa. The politicians were very scared, the white politicians were very scared to give the go-ahead for attacks into neighboring states. But because the military situation became so bad, they got to the point where the military commander said, man, we've got to do this. No matter what the political and economic repercussions are, we must do this. And so that is when they authorized these things. So when they saw that the blacks and the commies, and you know, the Russians and Chinese would send generals and officers to come and set the blacks up, to train them, to equip them, to check them, and so forth. They were getting modern weaponry. And then the whites would, meanwhile, the whites are struggling to get guns. The whites are using old equipment. So here are the whites using old equipment and welding things together and trying to invent new equipment because we don't have what the blacks have. The blacks are getting modern weaponry. Sometimes the blacks even got tanks, like in Zambia at one point. The blacks were getting tanks. We didn't have a tank in Rhodesia. We had to build a vehicle that could fight a tank. So they had to say, how are we going to build a vehicle that can fight tanks in the bush? And they actually invented a vehicle. And what I didn't know was the South Africans had also been capturing tanks, and they gave some tanks to the Rhodesians secretly. So we had like a handful of tanks in the country that we didn't know. They were actually Russian tanks, and we never really used them. But these cross-border raids became the big thing. And our little Air Force, our Army was 28,000 strong. Our Air Force was 1,000 people, the entire Air Force, the personnel on the ground as well as the pilots and so forth. In total, the Air Force was about 1,000 people strong. The aircraft were old. Our most effective aircraft was a Hawker Hunter. That was a fighter bomber. They phased out the Vampire. The British Vampire jet was already way too old. The Rhodesian bombers were Canberra bombers. They were so old that they had to be careful of putting loads of bombs into them at night because they were subject to so much wear and tear that they feared that the bombs would actually tear out of the aircraft. But these old aircraft did well, and they ran and they did bombing raids. They sometimes did bombing raids as far afield as Angola, where they flew about 1,000 kilometers, and I think they once even attacked Tanzania, which is German East Africa. But most of the other bombing raids were closer by, and they would either bomb them or they would do bombing in conjunction with ground attacks. And they found that that hard combat actually worked well for the whites. And probably the biggest battle they had was a battle that was inside Mozambique that lasted about a week, where they actually brought in artillery. So it was about the biggest battle they ever took part in. And the places they attacked, the blacks had lots of heavy weaponry that the Russians had given them.
So they were basically winning, but yet they still lost the political war.
Just like Germany. Same thing.
Yeah. So now power essentially in the way that in 1994, power went over to the blacks in South Africa. In Rhodesia, that year would have been 1980. Is that right?
Yes. There was a bit of a stepping that we didn't give power directly to the black commies. We tried to give power to blacks who were more pro-white and pro-Western. So in about 1978, 1979, I think it was, 79, we had an election.
Well, what I was going to ask you was, so when the whites are fighting fairly successfully with these various maneuvers and weapons, what's the black population of Rhodesians and what is their general attitude toward all this war? Is there really a sharp distinction between communists and just average blacks, or is there kind of a gradation, or how would you see it? And how many of them are there besides the 250,000 whites that are actually in the country?
At the time, the population of the blacks was 6 million. So strictly speaking, we were outnumbered more than 20 to 1. And that was the number of blacks there were. But of course, not all the blacks are busy fighting. Most of the blacks are actually working for you. And they are working on farms and things. But there are lots. You see, Rhodesia was more primitive than South Africa. So in South Africa, lots of the blacks live in townships next to cities. In Rhodesia, it was much more like Vietnam. Most of the population lives in villages. So those villages are far away in the bush. These blacks are engaging in their subsistence living. And now these terrorists are coming in, and they're coming with their political ideas. Initially, when the communist terrorists were coming in, the blacks were not keen on supporting them. The blacks would even go and report these terrorists to the whites, and the whites would go and kill them, catch them and kill them. But initially, the blacks were not interested in communism. There were quite a number of blacks who were saying to their fellow blacks, they were saying, look, you guys aren't going to be able to rule the country better than the whites are. So, how is this going to be better for us? But what happened was the communist terrorists learned in Rhodesia, as they learned everywhere else, that the answer to this is violence. So when they couldn't win the argument logically, then they would just start torturing them. And then they just set examples. Then they'd say, this guy, he's a traitor, he's friendly to whites, so now we're going to cut parts of his body off while he's alive, and we're going to get his wife to cook it, and she's going to eat some of his flesh, and then we're going to kill him. And they did those kinds of things to instill extreme terror on the blacks. So the blacks would know, if you cooperate with the whites, the other blacks are going to come and they're going to cut you up. And that is basically how they dealt with treason, which, by the way, could be a lesson for us too. That is how they dealt with race treason as they saw it from their side, which is valid. I mean, for them, on a racial scale, it's their decision as to which way they want to go as a race. But the constant prodding of these terrorists, and initially when these terrorists came in, although they were armed with mortars, machine guns, hand grenades, landmines, rocket-propelled grenades and all that sort of stuff, they'd go and they'd mine the roads so that people could get blown up. They'd try and blow up vehicles. Landmines was a big feature in the Rhodesian War. Like the IEDs are a big feature of your wars in the Middle East.
Yes.
Landmines,
yes.
Same thing. The landmines were so bad because Rhodesia was primitive, only certain major roads were tarred. So all the non-tarred roads, of which there were plenty to the farms, they could plant landmines there. And they planted landmines by the thousands. And those landmines were blowing up whites, blowing up blacks. They actually probably blew up more blacks than whites. When I was a kid, our farm was next to the main road that goes to the east. When I was a kid, we'd have helicopters flying over the farm. We'd see, there go the jet aircraft and so forth. But the thing I saw the most was convoys, military vehicles going out or coming back. But a thing that I saw lots of was you'd see trucks towing and bringing back vehicles that had been blown up by landmines. I often saw trucks blown up, 80-seater buses being blown up, common. They blew up lots of vehicles, and you'd see the damaged civilian or military vehicles being towed back to Salisbury for repair. So the blacks initially spent much of their time politicizing and teaching the other blacks about the benefits of communism. So they spent lots of time on education, what they called education, but actually indoctrination, and teaching them about how bad the white man is, what a piece of shit he is, and why communism is going to make life awesome. When communism comes, we're all going to be equal, and you're going to live in the same house as a white man. In fact, the blacks of South Africa right now in 2017 are still praying and hoping and pushing for that, because that's what they were told. They were told, you're going to own his farm, you're going to live in his house. In 1994, this is a bit off the topic, but just to give you an idea, Alex, in the 1990s, especially 1994, before the blacks took over in South Africa, there were white people who would say, you know what, some blacks pitched up at my house, and the blacks were saying, we like your house. Yeah, we think we're going to have your house. The blacks would come and tell the whites up front, hey, your house, we're going to get your house. And that is what the blacks believed. They were told all sorts of lies. And so in Rhodesia, eventually, the first thing they had to overcome was their own population. And once they got their population to support them, that's when it got harder and harder. And so eventually this just became a tougher and tougher fight. And then, of course, more and more blacks were coming in. They were training more. And you know, the blacks who were fighting us were being trained by the Warsaw Pact. So blacks would come and abduct. They would come and abduct black school children. They'd abduct them from their classes, march them across the border, and then send them off for training somewhere in Africa, Tanzania, Libya, Cuba. Some of them might even go to somewhere in Eastern Europe and Russia. Alex, they were training thousands of blacks, and it's the whole of Eastern Europe and the Warsaw Pact and the Russians and Chinese who were training these blacks, arming them and sending them back to come and attack us. That is what we faced.
Yeah. Well, you take someone who has a low IQ of like 70, and on one hand you say, look, here's your, you feed them the carrot and the stick. And the carrot is you're going to get the white man's beautiful palace instead of your mud hut. And the stick is we're going to cut you up and feed you to your wife if you don't go along with us. Now, you figure out what you want to do.
Yes. Yeah, it was.
And they make the decision.
Yeah.
I spent earlier today reading E. Michael Jones about the Scottsboro Boys. It was the biggest case in the U.S. down in the 1930s. It was more or less a fake rape that was trumped up, and there was a big trial. And the point is, the blacks were on trial for a supposed gang rape of a couple of white women. And communist Jews in New York City defended these blacks and were super obnoxious to the whites in Alabama, but they were trying to foment a communist revolution. The communists of the International Labor Defense, something like that, sent their people down to Alabama to stir up trouble. So this is a time-honored technique of the Jews that crosses all continents to try to use the blacks to destroy white civilization with their communism.
Alex, from what I've seen of the Jews and my studies of the Jews are absolute cowards. A Jew is an absolute coward of the worst kind. Don't be fooled by the supposedly brave Jews of the Israeli army. Jews, as a rule, are absolute cowards. And that is why they need the blacks. They need the blacks because they themselves will never put their own lives in danger. You have those quotes of the rabbis who say, oh, a Jewish fingernail is worth more than the lives of 1 million Arabs. A Jew's an absolute coward. But now he realizes that he needs to make people kill each other. And so that's where blacks come in so handy for them. Blacks are like born cannon fodder. Just lie to him enough and he may be inept, but if you get enough of them and you can find ways to get enough of them armed, yes, then eventually they can put up some kind of pressure. It's not a great army, but hey, it eventually does the trick.
Well, Jan, I don't know why I was going to 1930s Alabama, for example, other than when you show through time. Why not go to George Soros today is paying for these Black Lives Matter thugs to attack white Trump supporters in America and foment revolution. And he's doing this. He's also paying for invaders in Europe.
Yes.
So Jew communist, Jew capitalist, whatever, they support the same side. Jew capitalist financiers supported the Bolshevik Revolution. The key is it's Jews doing what's good for Jews, destroying white nations, whether the American South, whether in South Africa or Southern Africa with Rhodesia, or Europe proper, or
Yes.
Australia, or anywhere.
Yes.
Anytime. This is what they do.
Alex,
They've got to be resisted.
And Alex, the greatest time and place in the history of the world where whites were subjected to this was, of course, the Germans and Europeans on the eastern front of Russia. They were eventually overwhelmed by masses. And I was just coming across yesterday a very brilliant German commander, Hermann Balk. And in one of his battles that he actually won, he was outnumbered 11-1 in infantry, 7-1 in tanks, and 20-1 in artillery. And he still managed to win the battle. But the Germans are like the blueprint. The Germans are the blueprint for what came to all of the rest of us whites.
Yes. Well, Jan, we've been going a while now. Do we want to wrap it up with how did your history in Rhodesia maybe end? And what happened to you personally, bringing it back down from the military and the political level to the personal microcosm?
Well, Alex, they wound up, the way Rhodesia came to a fall was basically after American intervention, and Kissinger said there is no solution to this except handover to blacks. So then Ian Smith started trying to find black leaders that he could co-opt. who could take control of the country, but take non-communist control of the country. So they tried that, and they had quite a bunch of black leaders who took part, including a guy called Bishop Abel Muzorewa. And they had an election that was free and fair, where the blacks of the country could vote, and they voted for Muzorewa as the president. And so they then renamed Rhodesia as Zimbabwe Rhodesia. But Zimbabwe Rhodesia only lasted a year or two, and this black prime minister, he was pretty useless actually, and what I discovered about him afterwards just disgusts me. But he was a total weakling, and it's another example of when a weakling is up against someone who's strong. And Mugabe was ruthless, and Muzorewa was a weakling. But under Muzorewa's rule, the whites were actually fighting even harder than before, and the Rhodesian army engaged in its biggest battles in that time. And the whites won. They did lots of things. They even totally collapsed all the economies of Mozambique and Zambia. They blew up every bridge in those countries and totally brought them to a standstill. But this weakling Muzorewa, he then allowed the other communist blacks to come in. They had an election. The British came as usual with their useless guarantees. Oh yes, we'll send the British police. We'll see that it's free and fair. But the commander of the Rhodesian army, General Walls, he wrote a letter personally to Margaret Thatcher, and he said to her that Robert Mugabe is not complying with the terms and conditions, because the Rhodesian army and the black troops all had to lay down their weapons, everybody had to go into camps, and then there would be an election for the nation. And Mugabe's guys didn't go into the camps. They handed in a couple of rusty old weapons, and all their guys stayed outside, and they spread the message among the blacks, and the message was, if you don't vote for us, the war will continue. And the blacks knew the brutality of Mugabe's troops. And so Robert Mugabe won. I think he got something like 63% of the vote. For us, Robert Mugabe was the worst possible outcome. I was at school on the day the election results were announced, and our teacher switched on the radio, and us white boys were sitting and listening, and when we heard Mugabe had won, nobody said a word. We all knew this is our worst nightmare come true. And my brother said to my dad and the rest of my family, my brother said to all of us, he said, we've got to get out of this place. This is going to turn communist. These are the worst blacks of the lot. Get out of here. There's no future here. And so I was actually the first one to leave. My father passed away in the same year that the blacks came to power. So my dad died, and I left school, and I came to South Africa. The South Africans had a mechanism for allowing Rhodesians in on military terms. So I'd not been serving in the Rhodesian army. If the war had carried on 1 or 2 more years, I would have been called up to fight. And as it was, some of the kids from our school were killed. I remember one of our prefects, he left school and he was killed the very next year in a contact. But I went and got into South Africa. I just wanted to get into the South African military, and they recommended that I rather go to the Navy because there were more English speakers in the Navy. So that's how I ended up in the South African Navy for a while. And I was the first of my family to leave, and the rest of my family came in the years that followed. Over the next 3 to 4 years, they all got out. And most of the Rhodesians, of the 250,000, about 2/3 of them left in the next 5 years. The whites as a whole pulled out. And it was the 1/3 who remained behind who later became the victims of the farm invasions.
So that's about 80,000 whites are left. Or like So about 80,000 whites are left, and among them are the farmers and
Some of the farmers, yeah.
Mugabe's. So some of the farmers are so mismanages the economy that people are basically starving. There's no export crops; they have to import food, and he's. I mean, that's what happened. So you and your family get out of there around right after 1980 or early 80s, and you've been in South Africa ever since, pretty
Yes,
much.
yes.
And then what is the situation? Let's, I guess, wrap it up. What's the situation then in Zimbabwe today, 30 years later, like you're saying?
Alex, today, I think it's fair to say that, well, they don't have a currency. Their currency collapsed a couple of years ago. They were using US dollars and South African rands as the only currency that they had. They've tried to revive it in various ways, but they've not been successful. Unemployment is probably in the order of 90%. Anything from a third or more of the population of Zimbabwe lives in South Africa more or less permanently. They work here, they earn money here, and they send money and food and products to Zimbabwe. If it wasn't for them living here, there'd be absolutely nothing in Zimbabwe. But that country's economy has collapsed massively. It probably collapsed by about 70 or 80%. And even when I was working at the bank, there were some computer programmers, black computer programmers from Zimbabwe. And I'd say to them, why don't you work in Zimbabwe? And they'd say to me, there's nothing going on there, nothing. So that country's completely fallen apart. If it wasn't for a huge chunk of the population living and working outside Zimbabwe, most of them are in South Africa, but others are in other neighboring states. Then they work there and they bring money and food and stuff into the country. If it wasn't for that and the discovery of diamonds in the eastern part of the country about 10 years ago, the country would have completely ceased to exist. But for all practical purposes, it really has ceased to exist. It is a fraction of what it used to be. You know, like I say, 70, 80%, easy 80% or more of the economy has imploded. And there's nothing much going on there. So, yeah, if you kick out the whites, everything goes.
Yeah, and Mugabe is still hanging on in power.
Well, Alex, you won't find the Jews and the liberals and the communists saying anything against him. All those liberals of the West, not one of them will complain about any of the things he's done. After he took After he took over.
Yeah, we know. I mean, like, we don't hear about South Africa or Zimbabwe ever since. As soon as they were turned over to blacks, they become utopias from the media point of view. And why would you need to write anything about utopia? Because it's perfect there.
And you know, Mugabe murdered 30,000 blacks. He killed as many blacks as died in the whole war. He murdered 30,000, and I've never heard the Western world, neither England nor any other country, saying a thing about it. Not a word.
No, they wouldn't ever say anything except about white on black violence, which is magnified and distorted. They don't talk about black on black violence at all. Yeah, sure, yeah. So, yeah. Just evil white racists and wonderful, wonderful native African blacks is the only way it's ever framed.
Yes.
But what about isn't Mugabe reduced to making a bunch of deals with Chinese to come in and exploit the minerals and what have you, since they don't have their own native ability to do that?
He's been selling those diamonds to the Chinese, and Israel has been a part of it. And Israel has also supplied him with stuff to keep the blacks down who are against him. Make no mistake, he's hated. When I speak to blacks, 80% of the blacks hate him. But, he's on the right side. He's on the Jew-commie side. So they can hate him as much as they want. It doesn't matter. He's got the raw power. He uses communist Chinese tactics. He's very brutal, very brutal. He is way more brutal than the blacks of South Africa can be. And he's extremely brutal. and they just have to live with it. He's crushed every single opposition that's arisen. He's in his 90s now. I suspect that he's going to try and get his wife to run the country when he dies. But we'll see what happens. But he's assassinated all of his competition. Anyone, even on his own side, that tried to go against him, he had them killed. They died in car accidents and all kinds of funny deaths. People in Zimbabwe, they just dropped dead like flies, and all of them were in parliament and close to him, and they just dropped dead. He's got a tremendous spying mechanism, and that's actually what keeps him in power. He spies on everything, and anyone who turns slightly against it, they die. Whether they are black, doesn't matter, they die. So he's actually got probably one of the harshest communist regimes in the world currently. And we Rhodesians said we're fighting against communism, and there you have it. So, yeah.
Yeah. And there you go. So within 50 years, you go from an absolutely fantastic 1,000-acre farms is considered a minimum, beautiful, food exporting, happy people, beautiful infrastructure, nice land. You go from that to money destroyed, farmers driven out, have to import food, black communist tyrant who murders tens of thousands of people and is paranoid and has a spy network, boom, all over. And this is called progress in the Jew-controlled Western media.
Alex, one thing I'd like to tell you. After 10 years of Rhodesian independence, in 1975, the annual growth in GDP of Rhodesia was 10% per annum. 10%. Nowadays, these countries, at best, with their fudged figures, are lucky if they can get 1 or 2% growth. And of course, that growth is mostly just lots of new blacks. But in the time of Rhodesia, and even in the time of the South Africans with the Boers, the growth, the physical, economic growth of the country was unbelievable, unmatched, never been matched. The blacks didn't even come close to any of that. It was just downhill where they were.
Yeah, and it's absolutely fascinating tale you brought us today. I'm glad we've had a chance to interview you and talk about this because it's something we don't see in America, and I hope people appreciate this on our Team White channel. And you know what? The whole point of Team White is those days can come again because whites have not lost their innate capacity to build beautiful civilizations. And I know it's alive in you, it's alive in me, and that spark is going to go from Team White out to our entire race. So once again, thanks for listening, and we'll be back with you with more exciting stories from Africa and other places real soon.
Thank you very much, Alex.